Hey, good morning, folks. My name's Jack Reagan. I'm an audit partner here with UHY in Columbia, Maryland. And welcome to our webinar on what you need to know to get the most out of your American Rescue Plan Act funds, or ARPA. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All the phones are currently on mute. We'll be taking questions, throughout the presentation. If you want to use the questions window that is in your control panel, or the chat, window that's in your control panel, we'll get those questions. I'll try to answer them in the flow of the presentation. If we don't get to them, I'll take a look at them at the end of the presentation, and we'll answer them at that point. And if it's something that I don't feel comfortable answering off the cuff, which would be an unusual situation for me, I'll make sure that I personally follow up with you afterwards, as we've got all the information on who is attending and the contact information from your registration. Also, over in your, your control bar, you should see a menu for handouts. If you click the little arrow and drop it down, I did put a couple of items over in there. I put the Treasury reporting and compliance guidance that was issued back in June. I put the most recent frequently asked questions document, which you'll find is that the feds every several weeks will release, usually on a Friday late afternoon after 4 o'clock, frequently asked questions document, where they will have, as it sounds, a question and an answer to a particular issue that they have been fielding. The most recent version as of this morning was July 19. I anticipate something coming out pretty soon on that. And then for this audience here in Maryland, I've also included a PDF that Senator Cardin's office did, showing all of the counties and the localities within the county and how much either the city, county, or town got in the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA funds. We're going to run the presentation for 60 minutes without going over. We'll probably will fill all 60 minutes. We'll send you a recording link to the webinar within 24 hours. There'll be a survey as well that comes out. I want to know how you feel like I did, if it was relevant content to you, if there are other topics that you would like me to cover, either in a webinar or a newsletter or some sort of forum regarding ARPA funds. Certainly game to do that, and I really appreciate y'all's joining us today. Again, my name's Jack Reagan, audit partner in our Columbia, Maryland office, UHY. I've been with UHY now for nearly 4 years. Prior to that, I was with a couple of other large national firms. I've spent most of my 33-year career doing federal, state, and local government, higher ed, and not-for-profit, with a focus on state and local government. I come by it honestly. My dad was a career federal employee, and my mother was a grant accountant for the Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation in Loudoun County, where I grew up and currently live. So I have come a short way in a long time, as you guys probably heard me say several times who have listened to me on webinars before. Some of my large clients here in the DC metro area have been Washington, DC itself, Loudoun, Fairfax, and Alexandria in Virginia, Montgomery, Anne Arundel, and Baltimore County in Maryland, and numerous other localities around the country. Currently, we're assisting a Maryland locality in the administration of their ARPA funds, and I'm also working for a large city in the Midwest and a smaller city in the Northeast have also signed on for some help in managing their ARPA funds. So I feel like we've got a pretty good understanding of how to get started in getting your strategy aligned the right way, so that these ARPA funds are expended in the best way possible and meet the spirit of what the federal government is looking for here. So a little bit about about the agenda. We're going to talk just briefly about who we are here at UHY. We'll give a brief overview of how much the localities around Maryland are receiving. We'll talk about what it can be used for. And then I want to walk you through what I think the life cycle is for the spending on ARPA and some ideas on how you can maximize the spend of that. And then as we've got questions, you can either put them into the chat or the question window, or we can also trade some emails at the end and have a little bit of an open discussion. So who are we? International professional services firm doing audit, tax, and consulting. Internationally, we're somewhere between the 15th and 20th largest firm in terms of the network that we've got. Here domestically, just in the United States, we're between the 30th and 35th largest firm in the country, with over 1,000 employees, revenues of over $190 million. And as we said, we've got 21 offices located in the US, including the one here in Columbia, Maryland. Maryland local governments, cities are getting $619 million, the counties are getting $1.2 billion, and the state itself is getting $3.7 billion. So there is a ton of money available on all of this, and we'll talk about what monies have been received already and what the cadence on the spending is going to be here shortly. This act was passed in March by the Biden administration, and what they want to do is to use this money to respond or mitigate problems that have either arisen under the COVID-19 health emergency or have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 health emergency. And that exacerbated by is an incredibly important concept, because a lot of the clients that I've been talking to have questioned the linkage between the projects that we're going to talk about here shortly and whether they're too far removed from COVID-19 to be allowable under this. A lot of the health problems, a lot of the negative economic outcomes, a lot of the systemic public health issues and economic challenges have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and that is what makes these costs allowable. So please, as you're looking at the legislation, be aware that this exacerbated by really opens the eligibility of a whole lot of projects to being allowable uses of spending here. There are provisions for you to be able to provide pay to essential frontline workers, those involved in public health, in public safety, first responders, those sort of things. I'm seeing a lot of governments take advantage of that provision to pay premium pay. You can do a calculation based on your revenues to see if there was a revenue loss that was incurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic to your locality. If there was, you can take that money that you've gotten for ARPA and move it back over into the general fund to replace lost revenues, and then you can spend it however you see fit. And there are a lot of governments around the country that are trying to take as much money as they can in the revenue loss calculation so that they have the maximum flexibility on spending that money. However, there is a political consideration on that as well, because I think that the public expects the money to be spent on these projects that are allowable under ARPA. And if you spend it on other things, you could get into a little bit of a political issue associated with that. So just wanted you to be aware of that. And there are provisions for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure that are allowable on this, but as you're probably aware, there's an infrastructure bill or two infrastructure bills that are really moving their way through the legislative process right now. My advice would be to hold off on using any of these ARPA funds for those infrastructure projects until we have clarity on what exactly is going to be allowable under those infrastructure bills. You've got considerable flexibility for public health and other programs that we're going to walk through with these ARPA funds that you don't necessarily have on the infrastructure. The funding process has already begun. Many of you have received money already as of the end of May. The first half of your deposit, you'll get the second half next May. You have to commit to spending these funds by the end of 2024, and you have to have spent them all by the end of 2026. Word of caution, since you have this money already, there is going to be a great temptation to commit to spending it all today on projects that you've identified today. My word of caution is there are probably going to be some great ideas on where you would like to spend this money that might come up in 2022 or 2023 or 2024, and you may end up kicking yourself for having committed to all of the projects today if a great project comes up in 22, 23, or 24. So you want to be having a strategic discussion about how quickly you want to go through the project evaluation process and then move over into the approving the projects and getting the spending into the pipeline and sort of figuring out how much is the right amount to do for this year, the next year, and the following year, so that you don't front load all these and again kick yourself at the back end for getting some great project ideas and then not having money available to spend on it. So the group, what I'm recommending is that you can call it a steering committee, you can call it a funding committee, I don't care what the label is, but I think you need to have a group of people made up of insiders and even some outsiders to the government that set the strategy and what I'll call the guiding principles for what you're going to use these projects for. It needs to have senior executive sponsorship. So one of the committees that I'm an advisor for has the deputy county administrator as the executive sponsor, and then there are representatives from the public health department, social services, public works, Homeland Security, and others on that. Another client of mine has a mix of outsiders, members of the not-for-profit community, the clergy, some business, other civic organizations that sit in there to make sure that there's a lens of spreading this generational money on projects throughout the community. When I look at how this spending is going to occur, I see three distinct phases, and we're right in the middle of phase one right now, or some of you may even just be beginning in phase one, which is the strategy piece. And what you're trying to do here is now you've got this bucket of money that you're allowed to use for a whole bunch of different things that we're going to talk about here shortly. And you need to have a good strategy on how you are going to spend that money. Once you approve the projects on which you're going to spend the money, then you're going to want to monitor them relentlessly to make sure that all the financial and non-financial information that you are going to need are obtained by you so that you can report that quarterly and annually to the feds. And that's the third piece, which is the transparency piece. But it all starts with strategy. And there's a significant emphasis in the legislation on making sure that you have a strategic engagement with the community. That can mean the city manager or the county administrator or the mayor are going out and talking to citizen groups. You're coordinating with other local governments. You're engaging the business community and the nonprofit community and the elected officials. There's everybody that is getting a seat at the table, and you're talking to all these different constituents, and you're saying, what do you want this money spent on? And you can do that through surveys. One of the governments that I know here in Maryland and another one that I know in Virginia put a survey up on their website. The county here in Maryland that I'm aware of got over 2,000 responses to their survey of, here are 12 different strategic areas. If you had $10,000 to spend, where would you spend it and how much would you spend in each of those areas? And they got a really good sense from the community of where they wanted this money spent. And that informed them on community sentiments. So the surveys, you've got the management sponsored meetings, you've got elected official sponsored meetings. I'm seeing a lot of town halls, both in person and virtually around the country, where they're trying to get a sense of where they want this money spent. A lot of governments are also putting a portal out there that to accept project applications from the community that says, you know what, here is a description of a project that I would like done, and do it. I would recommend in 50 to 250 words. 250 word is a magic limit because every project that gets approved for ARPA funding needs to get reported up to Treasury, and there has to be a 250 word or less description of that project that accompanies all the Treasury reports. So now you've engaged the you've engaged the community, all these different community groups through surveys and meetings and others. And now what you want to do is to take that information you've got and align that information with your strategic plan that is reflected in your operating budget, that's reflected in your capital budget, other strategic documents that your county administrator, your city manager, your town manager, your elected officials have all established. And I call this the guiding principles document. Is what you want to have at the end of this is, hey, here are the things that we're going to use as we get all of these projects. And let's talk about, a local government that may have received, say, $5 million. All right. I'm betting you are going to get 10 or 20 or $30 million worth of asks for the spending of those those funding. So you're going to want to have a way of funneling down this $30 million worth of project asks down to the $5 million of money that you've got available to spend. So you have to align those community priorities with the organizational priorities. And you filter all those project submissions through this steering committee, and the steering committee says yes or no as to whether or not those projects should be funded. This is another takeaway that I can't emphasize enough, which is you absolutely need to develop a standard taxonomy for naming all of these projects. You have to give each project a unique identifier so that you can report that up to the United States Treasury. Because again, all these projects that have to get reported up to Treasury are done on an individual basis, and they have to be tracked and given a name. What I've suggested as a standard naming taxonomy is the first two digits are the fiscal year that the project was approved. So 22, 23, 24 in this case. We're going to talk about the federal project categories here shortly, but there are more or less, there are 7 different categories, but the 4 biggest ones are public health, negative economic outcomes, disproportionately impacted communities, and infrastructure. So pH, NEI, DISP, INF, those would be the acronyms that I would use for those federal categories. And then project number 001, 002, 003. So the first one that you would do for public health, I would recommend you name it 22 pH 001. That way you can query your system and pull all of the 22s, or you can pull all of the public healths, and it will be very easy to track each of those projects within those groups. Use your existing procedures, whatever you're using in your general ledger. Use that standard general ledger chart of accounts so that you're dropping all of the expenses in exactly the same categories, exactly the same accounts across all of these projects. The more standardized you have this at the very beginning, the easier the quarterly and the annual reporting process for you is going to be at the back end. Each of these projects, you're going to need to make a call that they go into a particular category, whether they're public health, negative economic indicators or outcomes, disproportionately impacted communities, etc. There may be several of these projects that, as you'll see, the different federal project categories and subcategories could fit into multiple categories. Do not overly complicate this process. Pick a lane, pick a project category, start it there, and then make sure that you relentlessly report it in exactly the same category every single time. This is not the time to be so precise to say, well, 75% of this project should be in public health and 25% of this should be in disproportionately impacted communities. Treasury's not interested in that. They're interested in simplicity. Pick a lane, get that project into that particular category 100% and just keep it there. And then finally, once you've got an approved contract, when I say that the contracts are tight, there are significantly more data gathering requirements for using this money for projects in public health, negative economic outcomes, and disproportionately impacted community projects than have ever been before. You're going to need to track not only all these financial indicators, but you're also going to need to track non-financial indicators for all of these. For the majority of the projects in those subcategories. If you, hold on just a second. If you've got if you're passing this through to an outside party to do it, either through a vendor relationship or a subrecipient relationship, in the contract, whether it's a vendor contract or a grant agreement that you have with that outside party, you are going to want to clarify in the original agreement, here is all the information you're going to need to report to me about your spending under this contract. And you're going to give them the financial indicators, and if they need to gather non-financial indicators, the number of people, maybe we'll give an example of a job training program. How many people entered the system, how many people finished the job training program, and how many people within 60 days of graduation or 90 days of graduation from the program got a job, and then are 6 months later, are they still employed at that job? If that's the sort of evidence-based data gathering that you want to do to demonstrate how effective this project is, you need to make sure that data gathering is in that contract with that vendor or that subrecipient so that you can get the information that you can report up to the federal government on a quarterly and an annual basis. It's so much easier to do that today with the projects when you are initially awarding the contract than going to them during October for the period ended September 30th and saying, I need this non-financial information. And the vendor or the subrecipient says, well, it's not in my agreement, therefore I'm not going to give it to you. And then you're scrambling to figure out how you're going to report up that information. So make sure the contracts are tight. I can't emphasize that one enough as an important part of this project setup. There are numerous, now these next couple of slides that I'm just going to present very lightly because these categories are in the compliance and reporting guidance, and they're also in, well, that's really where they are in the handouts that I've got that you'll be able to see. But there are all sorts of different subcategories under public health and negative economic that we're going to go through. So you can see COVID vaccination costs, contract tracing, prevention in congregate settings. So, I'm seeing a lot of projects around renovations at nursing homes and prisons and schools, seeing a lot of projects around physical plant changes to public facilities. So a lot of you who may have an old city hall that is unair conditioned and you've never had the money to be able to air condition City Hall. Here you're able to get the money to air condition City Hall because improving ventilation to prevent the spread of COVID-19 among people that are using City Hall is absolutely an allowable expense. So those physical changes to public facilities and you link it to mitigating the spread of COVID-19, absolutely allowable. I'm seeing a lot of unique programs in both mental health and substance abuse services that are being put in place because those programs or those problems, those societal ills have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and we are trying to put these new programs in place to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Negative economic impacts, you can see a bunch of those projects. So a lot of food programs. I know one for a client of mine, they're replenishing the several $1 million of food program monies that have been spent down during the pandemic. Eviction prevention, as you guys have seen, there are all sorts of news articles about how much money is available for eviction prevention. A lot of states, a lot of localities are also using this money as the states and the federal government have stopped the additional unemployment benefits. They're saying, all right, we're going to extend those and we're going to use our ARPA money for those. Job training is another huge one. Additional aid to nonprofit organizations is another good one. Services to disproportionately impacted communities falls into a couple of different buckets, whether it's education assistance, creating healthier childhood environments, providing housing support, or other health matters. These last social determinants of health, I'm seeing a lot of very unique programs in those areas that are meant to mitigate the ongoing impact of health matters in qualified census tracts that are defined as disproportionately impacted communities whose problems have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So what you need to do is you're getting all these projects that come in. You say, yeah, we're going to spend money on that. It looks like it's allowable. Then you assign one of these buckets, either public health, a negative economic impact, services to disproportionately impacted communities, or infrastructure. And here are different, clean water, drinking water, broadband are the different categories that fall in there. So you got to pick a lane on all of these. Now, what are you monitoring? You need to make sure that you are tracking any payroll costs that are being charged to these grants any non-payroll costs that are being charged to these grants, and then any monies that you're passing through to subrecipients. If you're passing money through to subrecipients, I read something the other day that said there are going to be over 10,000 new organizations that will trip over the magic number to get a grant audit done for the first time as recipients now of these. That's a $750,000 threshold. You're going to want to track all these subrecipients separately. I'm highly recommending for any project where they are spending money outside of the government, either on a vendor or on a subrecipient, that you hold some sort of training webinar on, hey, here's what I'm going to do to monitor the money that you are spending on my behalf in this project or on this program. That way it's very clear to them what they need to give to you and what you're expecting from them when you are monitoring their costs, either in the office or if you do a site visit to their location. For all of these projects, as I indicated earlier, we're going to want to give it a name. You're going to want to have a very clear number of how much you've approved. We already talked about the unique identification number that you're going to want to assign. You're going to want to make sure that you assign it to a project expenditure category, one of those buckets on the long laundry list in those 4 federal categories that we included. So that's all part of the project setup. And then finally, you're going to want to have this 250-word or less description of the project that says, here's what I'm going to do with this money. Here's when I'm going to spend this money, when I'm going to start, when I'm going to finish. And, you know, here is how those services are going to be delivered. Either government employees are going to be providing that service, vendors are going to be providing that service, or subrecipients are going to be providing that service. So you need to do that in 250 words or less for every single project. So jumping back a second to that, and I wish I'd remember to bring this up then, but you've got a very strategic decision that you're going to need to make. And let's talk about that $5 million of funding that you've received. Strategically, the steering committee is going to need to address, do I want to do 10 $500,000 projects or 100 $50,000 projects? Those are 2 totally different dynamics, and it can increase or decrease the complexity of the monitoring, at least purely in the numbers. I don't want to give the impression that just a large project is easier to track. It's not. It's not necessarily easier to monitor. It's just different to monitor. So as you're looking at these quarterly reports and annual reports, the more projects you approve, the longer and the more detail that is going to have to go into the report, because you're going to need to give for every single project aligned in those federal categories: name, amount, ID number, description of the account, and then you're going to need to track the expenditures. You're going to need to track the following 4 data points: current period obligation and cumulative obligation, and then current period expenditure and cumulative expenditure for every single project. I keep coming back to that. So setting up and making sure that you're using a standard naming taxonomy, a standard chart of accounts for all of these, so it's easy to pull that report at the end of every quarter and at the end of every year to report all of this stuff up is absolutely critical. And then you're going to need, through your monitoring controls, to report up the status of a project. Either it's not been started yet, it's less than 50% complete, it's over 50% complete, or it has been completed. Those are the 4 buckets that they want you to report this in. There's a Treasury portal that has been opened up that folks will begin to report into. Actually, a lot of the larger recipients, all the larger recipients are required to report up their first interim annual performance report as of the end of July. They have to report it up next Tuesday. The 31st of August is when that report is due. So that level of detail, in order to get it done at the back end, and I like to work backwards. All right, what's my report look like? Here's all the stuff I need on the report. Okay, so when I'm setting up the project, what are all the data elements that I need to set up so that at the back end I can report all of that? But that is very much a Treasury focus. But there are a ton of other people that you are going to be reporting all of this information to. You're going to need to design a report to make sure that that project sponsor, that project owner knows exactly what they've spent and how well they're doing, both on financial performance measures and non-financial performance measures that you may have to gather. And I'm probably going to do a separate webinar on advice that I'm going to give on how you will design and track the non-financial performance measures for those projects in public health, in negative economic outcomes, and in disproportionately impacted communities that you need to gather and report on. So you've got to have a mechanism to get the information to the project owners. Then you're going to need to get the money to the department, because that's where the appropriation is coming out of, is going to roll up into these department budgets, and then it's going to roll up to the chief financial officer, director of finance, treasurer, whoever your main finance official is. So as I'm layering this, I think the most level of detail you need to give is to the project sponsors or owners, potentially a little bit less to the department leaders, a little bit more aggregated at the chief financial officer level. I'm sure that the city manager, county administrator, town manager is going to want to have separate reports tracked on this. And then you're going to want to provide information to the elected officials, and then finally to U.S. Treasury. I think you need to, in order to be really efficient in the way that you're going to do this and controlling the spending up front, is you're going to need to design those reports and find out what those leaders want so that you can create those reports up front and provide that to them on a regular cadence. I'm recommending certainly no worse than monthly. I know the difficulty that it may be in providing a high level of information or a lower level of information especially to the elected officials. There's always a tug of war, as I don't have to tell all you guys, sort of between the management of the locality and the elected officials of the locality as to how much information is too much versus how much information is not enough. I don't want to go down any political roads on all this, so just get an agreement up front as to the content of the reports that are going to be provided to the city council, to the supervisors, to whatever board you've got that's running the organization and overseeing and in their fiduciary responsibilities as elected officials, the activities of the professionals who work for the locality. Get that agreement as to what that report is going to look like up front. But with always keeping an eye on the fact that I got to report all this stuff up to Treasury quarterly and annually. And the last thing that I want to make absolutely clear with regard to reporting is that the annual Treasury reports don't just sit at Treasury. Once you hit send and they upload there, you have to post them on your local government's website so that they are available to the public. That is a specific piece of the legislation that says, you know what, we have to make these reports publicly available. All right, so that the way that I picture reporting, and you know, I've got some wonderful graphics people who've helped sort of pull this thought in my mind. You know, and I talked a little bit about that funnel. You know, got all these projects that funnel down into your different program areas, and you have to report those internally to your city council or your county board. You have to report them to the city manager or the county administrator, and then you have to aggregate them into specific federal buckets, which are ultimately reported up to the treasury. So, you know, I think that this is a good graphic for showing how this will progress from the project level to, my word, sort of the department level or the program level, and then start working its way through the process to get to the elected officials and to the city and county administrators, and finally up to Treasury, with the knowledge that it ultimately ends up getting reported to the federal government at the end of the quarter and at the end of the year. So how often do you have to report? For governments over a certain size, and I know a lot of you on the webinar today are of a smaller size, and you do not have to do these annual performance reports. I believe the threshold is 50,000 residents or fewer. Don't need to do these annual reports that are due on the following date. So the larger localities, for those of you that are over 50,000, you have to report as of July 31, 2021 by Tuesday, and then the rest of the time your due dates are going to be at the end of July for all of these. And again, that's only for governments of a certain size, but everybody has to do quarterly reports. And as you can see on this slide, all the quarterly reports are due 1 month after the end of the calendar quarter, and they will be quarterly except for this first one, because they know that there wasn't a lot of spending in Q2 on a calendar basis this year. So they said, you know what, just from the award date, which is considered to be March through September 30th, they're going to be due in October, and then everything's going to be due at the end of January, end of April, end of July, end of October. So those are the quarterly reports that are going to be due from everybody. Annual reports are only due for the larger ones. Quarterly reports are due for everybody. So what is my advice on setting all of these up to start with, and to make sure that you're effectively spending these ARPA funds? It is to make sure that you're engaging the public, your management, and your elected officials now. Figure out what they want the money spent on, and then align those desires of where they want the money spent with the strategic direction of the government that is reflected in your operating budgets and your capital budgets. You're going to want to set these projects up absolutely consistently from the start. Every single entity is going to, every single project, you're going to want to set up the same way. Use that naming taxonomy for the projects that I suggested earlier, so it makes it easier to pull those. Use the standard chart of accounts for making sure that everything across all of the projects is consistently accounted for. And you're going to want to relentlessly monitor. You're going to want to look at invoices. You're going to want to look at drawdown requests. You're going to want to look at the cadence of how the spending is occurring on all of these projects to make sure that if a project is supposed to be a 24-month project and you're at the end of month 3, so you're 1/8 of the way through the project, but they've already spent 50% of the funds, you're going to be, oh, wait a minute here, why are they spent so much on that? You're only going to be doing that if you stay on top of the monitoring of these projects. You're going to want to report. I'm suggesting every month. You're going to want to report up to the senior government officials. Make sure that the chief financial officer makes sure that the mayor or the city manager or the town manager, or the county administrator, and the elected officials. You're going to want to have a consistent reporting format that you are going to show them on a regular basis. I'm suggesting monthly. And then finally, you're going to want to make sure you do the report on time to the federal government. They are going to watch the timing of these reports very, very closely. And if you don't submit your report on time, I'm betting within a few weeks' time, you'll be getting some sort of call or email or correspondence from Treasury. It's like, we need our report. We need to get our report. With that, that's really what I wanted to cover in this. I know that we've got a fair amount of time here at the end for questions. I haven't seen anything come in across the chat or the questions window. I'm not going to keep folks on for the sake of just filling the whole hour. We got 47, 48 minutes of content in here to you. I hope this was useful to you. I appreciate your joining, for being subjected to me. You do get my phone number and my email address, to where, if you've got questions on this, or if you've got feedback on this presentation, or you've got ideas for another presentation, or a newsletter topic or something like that, or you just want to kick something around, hey Jack, what are you seeing? That's part of what I do for this community. I have not been this excited in my career for the opportunities that are out there to truly make a difference to generations to come for how this money is spent. It's going to be highly impactful. But we're the gatekeepers, you who are on this webinar, and we in the audit and consulting community are the gatekeepers to make sure that this money is well spent. And I'm very excited about this opportunity to assist in that regard. So with that, I do appreciate your joining today. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you've got any questions or concern. Stay safe. Be kind to everybody, wash your hands, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.